Two videos to start you out with. The first comes from faraway Buryatia, where a human rights activist lady says that the Buryats in the military service had twigged that the Kremlin doesn't consider them proper Russian Federation, RF, citizens. It's not okay to get a lot of European Russians killed fighting the Ukrainians, but Buryats, that's more okay. She says her organization is working with several hundred, almost 350 service personnel who want out of the Russian army. Also, she says, it seems like racial prejudice against Russian citizens of Asian background happens pretty regularly. I would say the meaningful element here is that if the human rights people are already talking openly about avoiding military service on grounds the RF government doesn't represent the interests of some of the minorities, that is a small crack in social cohesion. Which, as we all know, is critical not just for the Kremlin getting what it wants, but if allowed to go too far, for keeping people in the Kremlin alive. The second video is just feel-good, but also a small study in Ukrainian resiliency. A school in Irpen that got demolished in the fighting has financing and hopes to rebuild so kids can study as of September 1st, and some nice volunteers from Kiev's Obolin district, which got rocketed but not fought over like Irpen, got together and bought kitchen equipment so the school kitchen can feed the kids. The fighting. Without a doubt, the most important development in the fighting today is the fact that the Kremlin said, for practical purposes, there won't be any serious fighting for a while. More exactly, the RF Defense Ministry announced that Russian units in Ukraine are currently conducting measures to increase combat capabilities. Decoded, this means the Kremlin intends to switch out exhausted troops and shot-up formations, or refill them with replacements, give people rest, and plan and train for the next big push. Since the great hocus pocus last March when the Kremlin suddenly decided it had no intention to capture Kiev, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv, and all those troops were actually going to conquer Donbass, I'm not aware of a time in this war when the Russians have stated, across the entire fighting front, it's time for a break. For the sake of outside source confirmation, let the record reflect that both the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War and the pro-Russian news platform Ryadovka in the last 24 hours said that the war still has shot, but the movement has stopped. For the record, the AGS reports the RF High Command appear to be trying to redeploy units from the southern Mykolaiv-Zaporizhia sector to the Donbass sector to renew attacks against the towns Bakhmut, Siversk, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk. It's not clear how long it will last, and without question, a great deal of lying and double talk is in progress in the Russian chain of command as officers at all levels are of them trying to shift the onus of attacking the next time onto someone else, while at the same time trying their darndest to suck as much time and equipment and people as possible, so if they do get the attack order they're properly beefed up. But in any case, pretty much everyone has been waiting for the RF offensive to run its course. This is about as clear as a confirmation as you can get that it has. Which is not to say the artillery will stop. I saw renewed claims from the UAF side that RF artillery firing was falling in intensity somewhat, but wherever there are frontline villages and concentrations of force, either the Russians hit it or they were likely to. Here is a rundown from today's Army General Staff evening sitrep of what the Russians shelled or hit with airstrikes in a situation where the Kremlin forces are conducting measures to increase combat capabilities. Sumy sector, the villages Vavkivka, Myropilya, Kindutivka, and Esmen, Kharkiv sector, Slatine, Mala-Danilivka, Ruski Tishki, Vasil, Kutuzivka, Pryshyb, and Yuzurivka. Sloviansk sector, Dalina, Korolka, Mazanivka, Bohorodikn, Adamivka, and Chepel, all with rocket artillery. Kramatorsk sector, Kryvaluka, Kuzminivka, and Hryhorivka, Bakhmut sector, Ivanodaryivka, Semihiria, Vuglogorska TPP, and Spern, Avdiivka sector, Avdiivka, Kurakivka, Novopavlivka, Zaporizhia sector, Lyman, Pozad-Pokrovsk, Prybuzk, Mern, Kotlyariv, and Blagodat. The image of Avdiivka is attached. To get an idea of the scale of the Russian bombardment, just multiply it by all the other settlements. Going the other direction, there was an explosion and a big column of smoke at Debaltsevo. Why stop at all? Some say it's the bodies. There was more information that leads one to suspect that that's because RF losses have been somewhere between very heavy and crippling. Ukraine military intelligence today said their agents have confirmed Kremlin authorities in Kherson are burning military dead to conceal losses, using open pits outside the city. The goal is to disfigure and char the corpses enough to make them unidentifiable, at which point the occupation authorities bury the dead soldiers as unidentified civilians killed by the Ukrainians. I know that sounds too ghoulish and ruthless even to consider, and that's fine. Just bear that theory in mind when you get to the part below about Belgorod. Today, Irina Vereshchuk, Ukrainian Minister for Questions of Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories, and comments reported by the Union and other major Ukrainian media, said that RF authorities in occupied Ukraine systematically blocked the transfer of practically all information concerning Russian war dead back to Russia, with the specific goal of preventing knowledge of the high numbers of soldiers killed in Ukraine from becoming widely known in Russia. She is one of the people, reportedly, involved in talks with the RF on the prisoner and dead soldier remains exchanges, and over the past few months, she has repeatedly claimed the UAF now has thousands of RF soldier corpses in cold storage that the Kremlin is refusing to repatriate. I know that sounds impossible considering the Russian Federation is supposedly a modern state with an educated population. How could a Russian government do that, and how could the Russian people accept it? Again, make no conclusions, just bear Vereshchuk's claim in mind when you get to the section about Belgorod. Belgorod Revisited. Many of you will recall that the day before yesterday, somewhat mysteriously, the RF authorities got upset and angry about some explosions and missiles flying around Belgorod, and it just wasn't clear whose missiles they were and what they hit. The only thing that was fully clear was that at least one RF anti-aircraft missile got launched and part of it crashed into a residential building. Several theories were trotted out: UAF sabotage teams, UAF kamikaze drones, UAF Tochka-U missiles, and even panicky Russian anti-aircraft gunners firing S-300 missiles at ghosts. One of the problems in figuring things out was the appearance of images of a mucking big crater supposedly in Belgorod, and probably way wider and deeper than an S-300 should make, image attached. It is worth noting that the local officials, in contrast to normal SOP, did not blame the Ukrainians right off. Well, today, a Russian opposition politician in a FB post came up with another theory. On the night in question, the RF military decided to launch some long-range missiles at Ukraine from the Belgorod area or passing over the Belgorod area. The Belgorod air defense people spotted the weapons and assumed they were Ukrainian and shot at least one of them down. In other words, the Russians missiled themselves at least twice, once with a shot-down strike missile, and a second time with the remains of an anti-aircraft missile that shot down strike missile. The thing to bear in mind is this: the very fact that one cannot dismiss that theory out of hand is one of the best acid tests there can be about the kind of opponent Ukraine faces. One incident of possible Russian incompetence could be anything: an anomaly, fake news, Western propaganda, sloppy reporting. But evidence that the Russian military leadership is very likely its own worst enemy has been piling up for months. Most historians would agree that's also consistent with Russian military tradition. Anyway, inflammatory FB post slamming the Belgorod air defense guys, attached. A home video of that eventful night, from which I can conclude nothing, is attached. Reach out and touch someone. The UAF today released a stat on how many HIMARS are actually in theater: 9. I think we can all agree that they are proving to be extremely effective, but using 9 of anything outside members of the Avengers that get at least 15 minutes of screen time to try and dent the RF army is probably not enough numbers to get the job done. Forbes, meanwhile, published a report that the RF has around 7,000 Soviet-era guided missiles originally designed to hit NATO warships or airbases, all of them highly inaccurate, but since they probably were going to carry nuclear warheads, no big deal. So the RF strategic bombardment of Ukraine, by this metric, should continue. Supposedly these are particularly the X-22 and X-55 anti-ship missiles and the Tochka-U surface-to-surface missile. According to Alexei Hromov, an AGS spokesman, today the RF has hit Ukraine with 626 cruise missiles. They're basically out of modern missiles, so now they will just use inaccurate, old missiles like the X-22. At sea. The Ukrainians landed people on Zmeyny, counted 30 destroyed pieces of RF equipment, and made a video. In Russia. In Crimea, General Yuri Lemar, the counterintelligence of the Southern Military District of the Russian Federation, was arrested on suspicion of abuse of official powers and receiving bribes. It is also reported that Yuri Lemar gave instructions to his subordinates to commit illegal actions, including particularly helping Crimean citizens dodge the RF draft. He is from Astrakhan and had worked in Crimea since 2020. In Moscow, meanwhile, the FSB detained General Grudzinski, image attached, for questioning and as a potential flight risk on possible charges of large-scale fraud. He is the director of the Research Center for the Russian National Academy of Rocket and Artillery Troops. According to an RF Interior Ministry statement, Grudzinski may have strong-armed local businessmen to contribute money to a humanitarian fund created to support Russian artillery and rocket troops, and then use the funds to enrich himself and his family. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. You can also watch other videos offered on my channel.